Top 1, the Nebra Sky Disk. In 1999, two illegal treasure hunters operating near Nebra in the German state of Saxony-Anhalt drove their metal detectors into a forested hillside and pulled something out of the ground that should not exist. The object was a bronze disc, roughly 12 inches in diameter, coated in a deep blue-green patina, and embedded with gold symbols that mapped the night sky with a precision no Bronze Age culture was supposed to possess. They sold it on the black market. It passed through a chain of collectors and dealers across Europe for 3 years before German authorities working undercover orchestrated a sting operation in Basel, Switzerland. In 2002, the disc was recovered. The men who found it were arrested, and what scientists subsequently discovered when they examined that disc changed everything they thought they knew about ancient European astronomy. The Nebra Sky Disk dates to approximately 1600 BCE, making it roughly 3,600 years old. It is the oldest known realistic depiction of the night sky in human history. But its age is not what disturbs researchers. What disturbs them is what it shows and, more precisely, what it knows. The disk features a full circle interpreted as the sun, a crescent consistent with a specific lunar phase, and a cluster of 7 dots arranged in a configuration that matches the Pleiades star cluster with cartographic accuracy. These alone would be remarkable. But the disk goes further. Along its edges are 2 arc-shaped gold bands, now partially missing, that correspond precisely to the angle between the summer and winter solstice sunsets, as observed from the hill where it was buried. This is not an approximation. This is calibrated, site-specific astronomical data encoded in bronze and gold by people who, according to every prior model of Bronze Age European civilization, had no business knowing any of it. There is also a third arc at the bottom of the disk interpreted as a solar boat, a symbol consistent with Bronze Age cosmological traditions in Egypt and the Near East. The presence of this symbol in central Germany at this period raises questions about cultural transmission and contact that remain unanswered. What makes the disk genuinely inexplicable is the lunar calendar correction embedded within it. The Pleiades cluster appears on the disk in 2 critical positions, marking the beginning of the agricultural year in March and its close in October. The gap between the gold arcs encodes a system for synchronizing the lunar and solar calendars, specifically by identifying when a 13th intercalary month must be added to keep them aligned. This is not a primitive observation. This is the Metonic cycle, a mathematical correction that was not formally documented anywhere in Europe until the ancient Greeks more than a millennium later. Scholars have confirmed through metallurgical analysis that the disk was modified at least 3 times over its history. With gold elements added and removed by successive hands, someone was maintaining it, updating it, and treating it as a living scientific instrument rather than a decorative object. The hill where it was found was a structured ritual site with additional Bronze Age weapons and tools buried nearby. The disk had been deliberately interred. It was not lost, it was hidden or placed with intention. UNESCO inscribed the Nebra Sky Disk on its Memory of the World Register in 2013, recognizing it as a document of outstanding universal significance. It is currently housed in the State Museum of Prehistory in Halle, Germany, under considerable security, examined by researchers from across the world. No one has been able to explain where the knowledge came from. The civilization that produced it left no writing, no institutional record, and no evident connection to the astronomical traditions of Egypt or Mesopotamia from which such knowledge might plausibly have been inherited. What they left was a disk, and the disk knows things it has no right to know. Top 2. The Bronze Age Collapse. The Bronze Age collapse occurred in the span of roughly 50 years between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE. The most advanced civilizations on Earth ceased to exist. Not one, not two, but all of them simultaneously. The Mycenaean Greeks, whose palace culture had dominated the Aegean for centuries, collapsed so completely that their writing system, Linear B, was forgotten entirely. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt as a military and diplomatic superpower, vanished from the historical record within a single generation. The city of Ugarit, one of the most cosmopolitan trading hubs in the ancient world, burned to the ground and was never rebuilt. Alalak, Hazor, Megiddo, Troy, one after another, the great urban centers of the late Bronze Age were destroyed, abandoned, or simply went silent. And then the world went dark for 400 years. This is not a metaphor. Archaeologists call what followed the Greek Dark Ages, a period from roughly 1100 to 700 BCE, during which population levels in the eastern Mediterranean dropped by estimates ranging from 50 to 90% in some regions. Literacy vanished. Long-distance trade collapsed. Monumental architecture stopped. The sophisticated palace economies that had organized labor, redistributed grain, and maintained standing armies across multiple continents disintegrated so thoroughly that later civilizations had no memory of them. When the Greeks eventually re-emerged into history, they had lost the very knowledge that their ancestors had written down. They were starting over. What makes the Bronze Age collapse the most confounding event in ancient history is not its scale. It is its simultaneity. Individual civilizations collapse for identifiable reasons. Empires fall to military defeat, internal revolt, economic failure, or environmental stress. But 7 interlocking civilizations spread across thousands of miles with entirely different governments, languages, religions, and military structures do not collapse at the same moment without a cause that operates at a systemic level. And that cause has never been agreed upon. The dominant theories have shifted across generations of scholarship. The Sea Peoples, a confederation of mysterious migrating groups referenced in Egyptian records, were long blamed as the primary agent of destruction. Rameses III recorded defeating them in battle around 1177 BCE, describing waves of displaced peoples moving by land and sea across the eastern Mediterranean. But closer examination has complicated this narrative. The Sea Peoples appear to have been symptoms as much as causes, themselves displaced populations fleeing conditions that had already destabilized their home regions. Blaming them for the collapse is like blaming refugees for the war that created them. Drought has gained significant traction as a contributing factor. Paleoclimatological data drawn from pollen records, isotope analysis, and stalagmites and sediment cores from the Sea of Galilee and the Gulf of Oman indicate a prolonged and severe drought affecting the eastern Mediterranean from approximately 1200 to 1150 BCE. A 2013 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science identified a sharp decline in rainfall across the region, precisely coinciding with the collapse window. Agricultural systems that had sustained dense urban populations failed. Grain stores depleted. Famine followed, but drought alone does not explain why cities burned rather than simply emptied. Archaeological excavation at sites across Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant reveals systematic destruction layers, burned administrative buildings, weapons caches, unfinished correspondence, and in the case of Ugarit, a clay tablet still in the kiln when the city was destroyed. A letter from the king of Alashia warning of ships sighted offshore and cities already burned was never sent. Someone died before they could send it. Internal rebellions, systems collapsed through disrupted trade networks, earthquakes, and disease have all been proposed as contributing factors. The current consensus, if one can be called that, is that the collapse resulted from a compound failure. Multiple stressors converging at once on interconnected systems, too rigid to absorb simultaneous shocks. Historian Eric Klein has described it as a perfect storm, but a perfect storm still requires explanation because the timing remains, by any honest scientific assessment, extraordinary. The same 50-year window, the same destruction signature across the entire known world. And whatever moved through those civilizations left nothing behind capable of explaining it. Top 3, the dog figurines. Somewhere between 14,000 and 400 BCE, across the length of the Japanese archipelago, a people known as the Jomon were making something. They were not building cities. They were not developing writing. They were not constructing monuments in stone. They were making small clay figures, humanoid in shape, but not quite human in appearance. And they made them continuously, obsessively, across an unbroken span of 14,000 years. More than 18,000 of these figures have been recovered from sites across Japan. Researchers believe the actual number produced over that period runs into the millions. And after more than a century of dedicated archaeological study, no one can agree on what they are. The figures are called dog. They range from a few centimeters to roughly 40 centimeters in height. What immediately separates them from any comparable ancient figurative tradition is their appearance. They do not look like humans rendered in a primitive style. They look like something specific, something deliberate, and something deeply strange. The most immediately striking feature is the eyes, large, circular, and protruding. They have been described consistently by researchers as goggles, a term that has become both inescapable and uncomfortable in the literature because no satisfying explanation for that shape exists within any known human cultural or environmental context. The heads of many dog are helmet-shaped, flattened at the crown or framed by structured ridges that sit flush against the face like a visor. The bodies are covered in dense geometric patterning, incised lines and spirals arranged with a consistency that suggests not decoration, but notation or perhaps replication, the faithful reproduction of something the maker was trying to accurately copy. The suits, if that is the right word, wrap the torso and limbs in layered configurations that repeat across thousands of individual figures produced across thousands of years and hundreds of miles. The consistency is not accidental. Something specific was being depicted. Most dog are female in form, or at least interpreted as such based on the presence of enlarged hips, breasts, and abdominal markings that some researchers associate with pregnancy. This has led to the most widely circulated hypothesis that the figures represent a mother goddess or fertility deity central to German religious practice. It is a plausible reading, but it does not explain the goggle eyes. It does not explain the helmet structures. It does not explain the bodysuits. Fertility iconography from other ancient cultures, like the Venus figurines of Europe or the goddess figures of ancient Anatolia, emphasizes the biological. The Doge emphasized the technological. Many of the figures were deliberately broken before being deposited. Legs snapped cleanly at the joint, arms removed at the shoulder, heads detached at the neck. The breakage patterns are too consistent to be accidental, and the fragments were frequently buried in separate locations. This suggests ritual, a specific and codified practice of deliberate destruction tied to whatever belief system the figures represented. Some researchers have proposed a transference model that illness or injury was symbolically transferred to the figure, which was then broken to destroy the affliction. Others have suggested the fragmentation was part of a mortuary rite. Neither explanation fully accounts for the geographic dispersal of the fragments. The Jomon people who made the Dog were not a primitive culture in any meaningful sense of the word. They were producing lacquerware by 9000 BCE, among the earliest known examples in the world. They were making pottery at a period when no other known culture had yet done so. They sustained a complex, stable society across 14 millennia without agriculture, without metallurgy, and without the urban infrastructure that conventional models associate with civilizational sophistication. And yet they spent those 14,000 years making the same figures with the same goggle eyes, the same helmet structures, and the same geometric bodysuits, refined and elaborated across the centuries, but never fundamentally altered in their essential visual vocabulary. No precedent for the Doge exists in any other ancient culture. No descendant tradition carries their imagery forward. When the Jomon period ended and the Yayoi people arrived from the Asian continent, the figures simply stopped being made. Whatever they represented died with the civilization that produced them. 18,000 figures, and not one of them has told us what it was looking at. Top 4. The Carnac stones, sometime around 4500 BCE, in what is now the Brittany region of northwestern France, a people whose name we do not know, and whose language we cannot reconstruct, began moving stones. Not small stones, but megaliths, some weighing several tons, quarried from granite outcroppings miles away and transported without wheels, without draft animals capable of the task, and without any tool more sophisticated than wood, rope, and coordinated human labor. They arranged these stones in rows, not clusters, not circles, not random groupings, but straight parallel lines running for miles across the landscape with a geometric precision that required sustained, organized planning across what must have been multiple generations. When they were finished, they left. They left no writing, no identified burial sites connected to the monument, no temples, no inscriptions, and no explanation. What they left behind was the largest megalithic site in the world, and after centuries of dedicated study, archaeology has not produced a single accepted theory for what it is for. The Karnak stone alignments consist of more than 3,000 surviving menhirs, the French term for standing stones, arranged in at least 11 parallel rows, stretching across three main groupings known as Menhir, Kermario, and Kurleskin. At their greatest extent, the alignments run for approximately 4 kilometers. The rows are not perfectly uniform in spacing, but they maintain a consistent directional orientation with a discipline that excludes improvisation. Geophysical surveys have revealed that hundreds more stones lie buried or were removed in subsequent centuries, suggesting the original monument was substantially larger than what survives today. Some estimates place the original count at closer to 10,000 individual stones. The civilization that built them predates Stonehenge by 1,000 years, and the Egyptian pyramids by roughly the same margin. They were Neolithic, meaning they farmed, kept animals, made pottery, and lived in settled communities. But beyond those broad categories, almost nothing is known about their beliefs, their social structure, or their purpose in constructing what remains the most labor-intensive prehistoric monument in Western Europe. Every major interpretive framework has been applied to Karnak and found insufficient. The astronomical alignment hypothesis, which has proven productive at sites like Stonehenge and Newgrange, has not yielded a confirmed result at Karnak. Researchers have proposed alignments with the midsummer sunrise, the midwinter sunset, and various lunar standstill positions. None have achieved consensus. The rows do not point cleanly at any confirmed celestial event with the precision that would be required to declare the relationship intentional rather than coincidental. Given the sheer number of rows running in multiple directions, statistical skepticism is warranted. Enough lines pointed at enough angles will eventually approach some astronomical target. The funerary hypothesis has fared no better. Megalithic tomb structures called dolmens exist in the surrounding region, and some are associated with the same cultural period. But the alignments themselves contain no identified burials, no skeletal remains, and no grave goods. They are not a cemetery. The defensive structure hypothesis was largely abandoned early, as the rows offer no tactical advantage and enclose no perimeter. The territorial marker hypothesis, that the lines demarcated land boundaries or resource zones, cannot explain why a culture would invest generational labor into markers that communicate nothing legible to any known symbolic system. What researchers agree on is the scale of the social organization required. Moving and erecting thousands of multi-ton stones across miles of terrain, maintaining geometric consistency across decades of construction, and sustaining the communal will to continue a project whose completion no individual builder would live to see implies a society with centralized authority, shared ideological commitment, and long-range planning capability that conventional models of Neolithic culture have struggled to accommodate. Local Breton legend recorded centuries later holds that the stones are Roman soldiers petrified by the wizard Merlin. Medieval Christian authorities planted crosses atop several of the largest menhirs in an attempt to neutralize what they considered pagan power embedded in the landscape. Neither explanation has satisfied science. The stones stand in their rows today, fenced off from tourists, monitored for erosion, and studied with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging. Each new technology applied to Karnak produces more precise data about what the stones are, but none of it has moved the field any closer to explaining why. Top 5. The Naga fireballs every year on the night of the full moon that marks the end of Buddhist Lent, known as Wan Ok Phansa. Something rises from the Mekong River. Not one thing, but hundreds of things. Glowing orbs, described consistently across generations of witnesses as reddish-pink in color and ranging in size from small sparks to spheres approximately the size of a human fist, lift silently from the surface of the water and rise in a clean, vertical trajectory into the night sky. They produce no sound. They emit no detectable heat. They leave no smell. They do not flicker or fluctuate. They rise to heights of up to 200 meters, then simply vanish. The event lasts for several hours. It happens along a specific 40-kilometer stretch of the Mekong River on the border between Thailand and Laos, concentrated most densely near the Thai town of Phon Phisai in Nong Khai province. It has been observed and documented since at least the 19th century. It happens every year without exception, and no scientific explanation proposed to date has satisfied the full range of what is observed. The phenomenon is known locally as the Naga fireballs, named for the mythological serpent deity of Buddhist and Hindu tradition, the Naga, believed to inhabit the Mekong and release the orbs as an offering to the Lord Buddha on his return from heaven. The cultural explanation is ancient, consistent, and held with conviction by communities along the river who have observed the event across generations. But the phenomenon does not require belief to occur. It occurs regardless of who is watching, regardless of the weather, and regardless of whether the observers are devout Buddhists, secular scientists, or visiting journalists with cameras. The scale of witnessing is not trivial. Hundreds of thousands of people gather annually at Phon Phisai for the Naga Fireball Festival. Observation is communal, public, and documented on video across decades of modern recording. The orbs have been filmed from multiple angles simultaneously. Their behavior is consistent across footage spanning many years. They rise from the water, they are silent, they glow, they ascend, and they disappear. Scientific investigation has produced several competing hypotheses, none of which has achieved consensus. The most widely circulated explanation, advanced publicly by a Thai scientist and dramatized in a television program in 2002, proposed that the orbs are produced by the spontaneous combustion of phosphine gas generated by decomposing organic matter on the riverbed. Phosphine is a flammable gas produced in anaerobic conditions and is known to ignite spontaneously under certain temperature thresholds. This hypothesis was broadly reported as a resolution to the mystery. It is not. Phosphine combustion produces flames, heat, and irregular flickering behavior. It does not produce silent, stable, self-contained spheres that rise in controlled vertical trajectories to heights of 200 meters. The physics do not support it. A geological hypothesis involving piezoelectric discharge, whereby seismic stress on crystalline rock formations beneath the river generates electromagnetic plasma orbs, has been proposed as an alternative. Earth lights, as this class of phenomenon is known, have been documented in other geological contexts and share some behavioral characteristics with the Naga fireballs. But piezoelectric discharge is not calendrically fixed. It does not occur on the same night of the same lunar cycle every year with the regularity of a scheduled event. Geological stress does not observe the Buddhist calendar. This is the detail that every scientific hypothesis has failed to absorb. The phenomenon is not random, it is not episodic, it is not triggered by variable environmental conditions. It occurs on one specific night annually, tied to a lunar calendar event at one specific stretch of one specific river, with a consistency that is not broken in living memory or documented historical record. In 2002, following the television program that promoted the phosphine explanation, a controversy erupted when witnesses and local officials alleged that Thai soldiers had been observed on the Laotian side of the river, firing tracer rounds into the sky to simulate the orbs. The allegation was publicly denied. It did not account for pre-modern historical documentation of the phenomenon, nor for the events that occur before any human presence is established along the relevant riverbanks each year. The Mekong rises in the Tibetan Plateau and runs nearly 5,000 kilometers before reaching the stretch of river where the orbs appear. Millions of people live along its banks. The fireballs appear in one place on one night every year. Whatever is producing them has not missed a single appointment. Top 6. Encephalitis lethargica. Between 1917 and 1928, something moved through the human population that medicine has never been able to name, locate, or explain. It arrived without a clear point of origin. It spread across continents during one of the most medically scrutinized periods in modern history, overlapping with the 1918 influenza pandemic that mobilized the full institutional apparatus of global public health. It infected an estimated 5 million people. It killed approximately 1 million of them outright. And what it did to the survivors was, by any clinical measure, worse than death. Then in 1928, it stopped completely, permanently, without treatment, without a vaccine, and without any identifiable environmental change that could account for its disappearance. It has never returned, and in the century since, science has never identified what caused it. The illness was named encephalitis lethargica by the Austrian neurologist Konstantin von Economo, who produced the first systematic clinical description in 1917 after encountering patients at the Vienna Psychiatric Clinic, presenting with a constellation of symptoms unlike anything in the existing medical literature. The name translates roughly as inflammation of the brain causing lethargy, but the term lethargy catastrophically understates what the disease actually did. In its acute phase, encephalitis lethargica produced extreme fatigue, fever, headache, double vision, and abnormal eye movements. These symptoms were alarming but recognizable as markers of neurological inflammation. What followed was not. As the acute phase resolved, a significant proportion of survivors entered a state that physicians at the time struggled to categorize using available diagnostic language. They became still, not unconscious, not cognitively impaired, and not in any conventional sense unaware. They were present. They could see, hear, and understand everything happening around them. They recognized family members. They could answer questions if addressed directly and given sufficient time, but they could not initiate movement. They could not speak spontaneously. They could not reach for a glass of water, stand from a chair, or turn their heads without external assistance. They sat or lay in postures of absolute suspension, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, their minds intact inside bodies that had effectively ceased to respond to conscious instruction. Von Economo described them as living statues. The phrase was clinical, not poetic. These patients were not in a vegetative state. They were not dreaming. They were experiencing continuous, lucid consciousness within a body that had been neurologically locked from the inside with no key. The post-encephalitic condition, as it came to be classified, persisted in many survivors for the remainder of their lives. Oliver Sacks, the neurologist who worked with a group of surviving patients at Beth Abraham Hospital in New York in the 1960s and documented their cases in his 1973 book, Awakenings, described individuals who had been in this suspended state for 40 years. 40 years of awareness, 40 years of watching the world move around them while they remained fixed. When Sacks administered the then experimental drug levodopa to these patients in 1969, many of them briefly awakened, becoming suddenly mobile, verbal, and fully socially functional before the drug's effects destabilized and the suspension reasserted itself. The awakenings were temporary. The disease had restructured something in the basal ganglia too fundamentally to be pharmacologically reversed. What caused encephalitis lethargica has never been established. The overlap with the 1918 influenza pandemic led early researchers to suspect a causal link, a theory that has been periodically revived and periodically undermined. Studies examining preserved brain tissue from encephalitis lethargica victims have not consistently identified influenza viral material. A 2004 study proposed that the illness may have been triggered by an autoimmune response to streptococcal infection, in which antibodies produced to fight the bacteria mistakenly attacked brain tissue. This hypothesis remains unconfirmed and contested. No infectious agent has ever been isolated from an encephalitis lethargica patient. No virus has been identified, no bacterium, no environmental toxin. The pathological changes observed in brain tissue at autopsy were consistent with inflammatory damage, but yielded no causative organism that could be cultured, sequenced, or identified. Sporadic cases resembling encephalitis lethargica have been reported in the decades since 1928, but none have occurred at an epidemic scale. None have produced the locked-in suspension in the proportions observed during the outbreak years. Whether these cases represent the same disease, a related condition, or a diagnostic echo is unresolved. 5 million people, a decade of devastation, survivors locked inside themselves for lifetimes. And then silence, as absolute and unexplained as the arrival had been. Whatever it was, it came. It rewired human nervous systems on a continental scale, and it left without leaving a trace of itself behind. Top 7. The Gloria Ramirez Case. On the night of February 19, 1994, A 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez was brought by ambulance to the emergency room of Riverside General Hospital in Riverside, California. She was in the late stages of cervical cancer. Her heart was beating rapidly and erratically, and she was only partially conscious. She was, by every initial assessment, a critically ill patient presenting with complications consistent with her known medical history. What happened in the next 30 minutes has never been explained. It sent multiple medical staff members to the hospital floor in convulsions. It prompted a hazardous materials response. It caused a wing of the emergency room to be evacuated, and it produced a physiological event in a dying woman that no toxicologist, chemist, or physician has been able to account for in the 30 years since. The attending staff began standard resuscitation procedures. They removed Gloria Ramirez's clothing, attached cardiac monitoring equipment, and administered medications to stabilize her heart rhythm. It was at this point that the nurses and physicians closest to her body began noticing things that did not belong in a hospital emergency room. Her skin had an oily sheen that was not consistent with perspiration. Her mouth, when open for oxygen administration, emitted a smell that staff variously described as fruity, garlicky, and similar to nail polish remover. These details were noted but not yet alarming. What came next was a nurse named Susan Kane drew blood from Gloria Ramirez's arm using a standard syringe. When she held the syringe up to pass it to another staff member, she noticed that the blood itself smelled of a chemical odor, sharp enough to be immediately noticeable in a room already saturated with the ambient smells of a working emergency department. She also observed what appeared to be manila-colored particles floating within the drawn blood, particulate matter that should not be present in human blood under any known physiological condition. She passed the syringe. A second nurse, Julie Gorshinsky, noticed the same smell and the same particles. Then Susan Kane fainted. She collapsed to the floor of the emergency room without warning. Gorshinsky, who had been leaning close to the syringe, began feeling nauseated and lightheaded within seconds. She stepped away from the patient and sat down. Then she too lost consciousness. A respiratory therapist named Maureen Welch, who had been standing nearby, fainted immediately after. Within minutes, a supervising physician was also on the floor. The emergency room, already managing a critical patient, was now simultaneously managing multiple staff members in various states of collapse, with more personnel reporting nausea, apnea, and muscle spasms as they entered the room. The decision was made to move Gloria Ramirez outside the building and continue resuscitation efforts in the parking lot, while the emergency room was evacuated and assessed for contamination. Of the 34 staff members working that night, 23 reported symptoms of some kind. 5 were hospitalized. Gorshinsky, who had been closest to the drawn blood, developed the most severe presentation, including hepatitis, pancreatitis, and a vascular necrosis of the knees, a condition in which bone tissue dies due to loss of blood supply. She spent 2 weeks in intensive care. Gloria Ramirez died that night at 8:50 p.m. Her body was held in isolation. Investigators from the county, the state, and eventually federal agencies, including the Centers for Disease Control, were called in to determine what had happened. The emergency room was sealed and analyzed. No environmental contaminant was found. No toxic gas was detected in the ventilation system. No chemical source was identified in the building. The most scientifically developed hypothesis, proposed by researchers at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in 1994, suggested that Ramirez had been self-administering dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO, a chemical compound sometimes used as an alternative treatment for cancer pain, and that this compound had reacted with the oxygen being administered during resuscitation to form dimethylsulfone and eventually dimethyl sulfate, an acutely toxic chemical agent in her bloodstream. The manila particles were proposed to be dimethyl sulfone crystals precipitating out of the blood at room temperature. It was a chemically coherent model. It was also never confirmed. No dimethyl sulfoxide was found in Ramirez's home. Toxicological analysis of her blood did not conclusively establish its presence. The Livermore hypothesis explained the mechanism, but could not establish the origin. Ramirez's family rejected the findings and commissioned an independent autopsy, which attributed her death to kidney failure caused by her cancer. The question of what she had been exposed to or what her body had produced was not resolved by either examination. The case was formally closed. The staff members recovered mostly. The emergency room reopened, and Gloria Ramirez, who came to be known in subsequent media coverage as the Toxic Lady, a designation her family found deeply objectionable, was buried in Riverside. What moved from her body into the air of that emergency room dropped trained medical professionals to the floor and hospitalized a nurse for 2 weeks has never been chemically identified, experimentally replicated, or satisfactorily explained. Top 8. The Flannan Isles vanishing. On December 26, 1900, the lighthouse tender Hesperus approached the Flannan Isles, a remote cluster of rocky outcroppings 21 miles west of the Outer Hebrides off the Scottish coast, to deliver supplies and rotate the crew of the Flannan Isles lighthouse. The lighthouse had been operational for just over a year. It was one of the most isolated postings in the British Lighthouse Service, situated on an island so inhospitable that local fishermen had historically refused to spend the night there, citing an atmosphere they described as deeply wrong, haunted in a way that predated any specific tragedy. The relief crew aboard the Hesperus had no reason to expect anything unusual. What they found when they arrived has never been explained in the 120 years since. The lighthouse was dark. This was the first anomaly visible before anyone set foot on the island. A working lighthouse does not go dark. The light existed for one purpose: to warn ships away from the rocks, and its absence was immediately alarming to the crew of the Hesperus, who had in fact noted during their approach that the light had not been functioning for at least several days prior to their arrival. Attempts to signal the lighthouse by horn received no response. A small boat was sent to shore. The relief keeper sent to investigate, a man named Joseph Moore, climbed the steep path to the lighthouse and found the entrance gate closed but not locked. The door to the lighthouse itself was also closed. He entered. Inside, the kitchen table was set as though a meal had been prepared and interrupted. 2 of the 3 place settings showed signs that the men had begun eating. One chair was overturned. The clock on the wall had stopped. The fireplace was cold. Everything else was in order. The beds were made. The logbook was in place. The lamps were clean, trimmed, and filled with oil, ready to be lit. The lighthouse was in perfect operational condition. There were simply no men inside it. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, 3 experienced lighthouse keepers with decades of combined service in some of the most demanding postings in Scotland, were gone. No note beyond the official log. No sign of a struggle. No indication of where they had gone or why. Weather records maintained on the Scottish mainland for the same period show no significant storm activity in the area of the Flannan Isles on December 15th or the surrounding days. The sea conditions logged by passing vessels were described as moderate. Whatever Marshall was recording, it was not a meteorological event that anyone else observed. The theory is not impossible. Rogue waves capable of reaching the heights implied by the displaced concrete block have been documented in the waters around the Hebrides. Men have been lost from exposed coastal positions in exactly the manner described, but the official theory leaves several details unresolved and has never achieved the status of established fact. The log entries describing psychological deterioration, communal prayer, and a storm no external record corroborates remain unexplained within the wave hypothesis. The bodies of Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur were never recovered. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was subsequently automated and today operates without human keepers. The island itself remains largely inaccessible and largely unvisited. No physical evidence beyond what was documented in December 1900 has ever emerged to move the case toward resolution. 3 experienced men on a rock in the North Atlantic who disappeared between one log entry and the next, leaving a meal on the table, a stopped clock, and a record of something that frightened them more than any storm they had ever known. Top 9. The Tartaria Tablets. In 1961, a Romanian archaeologist named Nicolae Vlasa was excavating a Neolithic settlement site near the village of Tartaria in the Transylvania region of Romania when his team uncovered a small pit beneath the floor of what appeared to be a ritual structure. Inside the pit were the cremated remains of a human being, adult in size, accompanied by a collection of objects including figurines, a shell bracelet, and 3 small unbaked clay tablets covered in incise symbols. The tablets were unimpressive in their physical dimensions. The largest was roughly the size of a human palm. They were fragile, irregular, and crudely made by any aesthetic standard. What they carried on their surfaces was not crude at all. The symbols incised into the clay bore a structural resemblance to early pictographic writing systems, organized, repeated, and arranged in a manner consistent with symbolic notation rather than decorative marking. When radiocarbon dating was subsequently applied to the organic materials found in the same pit, the results produced a date of approximately 5500 BCE. If that date is accepted as applicable to the tablets themselves, they are the oldest written documents ever found. They predate the earliest Sumerian cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia by more than 1,000 years. They predate the earliest Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions by a similar margin. They would mean that writing was not invented in the ancient Near East. It was invented in Europe. And everything the academic world had established about the origins of human civilization and literacy would require fundamental revision. The archaeological community did not greet this possibility with uniform enthusiasm. The controversy that erupted around the Tartaria tablets in the decades following their discovery has never resolved, and the tablets remain, in the precise formulation of several researchers who have studied them directly, the most explosive and most systematically ignored discovery in the history of European archaeology. The symbols on the tablets number approximately 40 across the 3 surfaces. Some are geometric, crosses, lines, and branching forms. Others are more figurative, what appear to be animal heads, a human figure, and forms that have been compared to the earliest known pictographs from the Uruk period in Mesopotamia. This visual resemblance to Sumerian proto-writing is itself the source of one of the 2 dominant interpretive positions. One school of thought holds that the similarity is not coincidental, that the Tartaria symbols represent evidence of contact or cultural transmission between the Danube civilization and the early urban cultures of the ancient Near East. The other school holds that the resemblance is coincidental, that the symbols represent a local, independent, and functionally different notation system that should not be classified as writing in any linguistically meaningful sense. The question of what writing actually is sits at the center of the debate and has prevented consensus more effectively than any evidentiary dispute. If writing is defined strictly as a system capable of encoding spoken language, then the Tartaria symbols almost certainly do not qualify because no one has been able to demonstrate that they represent phonetic values or grammatical structures. If writing is defined more broadly as any systematic symbolic notation used to record and transmit information across time, the tablets meet that definition and predate Sumer by over a millennium. What is not disputed is that the Tartaria site belongs to the Vinca culture, a sophisticated Neolithic civilization that occupied a substantial portion of southeastern Europe between approximately 5700 and 4500 BCE. The Vinca culture produced standardized pottery, planned settlements, and a symbolic tradition represented by hundreds of incised markings found across dozens of sites throughout the region. Whether that symbolic tradition constitutes a writing system, a proto-writing system, or an unrelated notation practice is the question that 60 years of argument has failed to settle. 3 tablets, 40 symbols, and a date that rewrites human history if accepted. The field has not accepted it. The field has not refuted it. The tablets sit in a museum in Cluj-Napoca, and the question they asked in 1961 remains, with precise and uncomfortable accuracy, unanswered. Top 10. The band of holes on a high desert plateau near the town of Pisco in southern Peru, stretching across the rocky terrain of a mountain ridge for a distance of approximately 1.5 miles, there are holes, more than 5,000 of them. They are arranged in tightly organized parallel rows, each hole roughly the dimensions of a human body, between 1 and 2 meters deep and approximately 1 meter wide. They are carved directly into solid rock and compacted earth with a consistency of size, spacing, and alignment that eliminates any possibility they were formed by natural geological processes. They were made by people deliberately, at significant labor cost, across what must have been an extended period of organized effort. The civilization that made them left no tools at the site, no construction debris, no grave goods, no skeletal remains, and no historical record of any kind acknowledging their existence. The Inca, who controlled this region before Spanish contact and who maintained detailed administrative and oral records of the landscape and its features, have no known tradition that accounts for the holes. Whatever made them predates the Inca and was not remembered by anyone who came after. The site is known formally as the Band of Holes, located in the Pisco Valley near the Jumi district of the Ica region on a terrain feature called the Cajamarca Plateau. It sits at an elevation that made sustained construction labor physiologically demanding. The rows run in a consistent directional orientation across the ridge, not following the natural contours of the land, but imposing a geometric regularity on the landscape that required deliberate planning and sustained supervision. From ground level, the site is difficult to comprehend in its full extent. From aerial observation, the precision of the arrangement becomes immediately apparent and immediately unnerving. Archaeological attention to the Band of Holes has been intermittent and underfunded relative to the site's scale and potential significance. Early modern documentation was conducted in the 1930s and again in subsequent decades, producing physical descriptions and rough counts of the holes without generating satisfactory explanatory frameworks. The remoteness of the site, combined with the logistical difficulty of systematic ground survey across 1.5 miles of irregular rocky terrain, meant that comprehensive analysis was delayed until aerial and satellite imaging technologies made large-scale pattern recognition possible. Without complete ground coverage, the hypotheses generated across decades of consideration have been numerous and almost uniformly unsatisfying. The most frequently proposed functional explanation is that the holes served as a storage system, a series of individual compartments used to measure, hold, or transport agricultural commodities, such as grain or freeze-dried potatoes, a food preservation technique practiced across the Andean highlands. This hypothesis draws on the known Andean tradition of organized food storage at the state level, and the Inca administrative system did employ sophisticated storage infrastructure across the region. But the storage hypothesis confronts several problems it has not resolved. Ritual interpretations have been advanced by researchers drawing on the broader pattern of landscape modification in the Andean tradition, which includes the Nazca lines and numerous other large-scale earthwork features whose function is understood to be ceremonial rather than utilitarian. The orientation of the rows, if extended, points toward no confirmed astronomical target that has achieved scholarly consensus. Without associated material culture, determining ritual function is effectively speculation formalized by academic language. In 2024 and 2025, drone survey teams and researchers utilizing high-resolution satellite imaging conducted new systematic analysis of the site, producing the most detailed spatial documentation of the Band of Holes yet achieved. The new imaging confirmed the extent and regularity of the arrangement, with greater precision than previous surveys, and identified subtle patterning in the spacing between rows that had not been detected in earlier documentation. The analysis generated renewed academic interest and several revised hypotheses. It did not produce a confirmed answer. What the new imaging made undeniable is the scale of intentionality embedded in the site. 5,000 holes, each requiring sustained physical labor to produce in solid rock, organized with geometric discipline across 1.5 miles of challenging terrain by a civilization that left no signature, no explanation, and no memory of having been there. The plateau is silent. The holes are empty. If these stories have changed the way you perceive the hidden anomalies of our world, please subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury. Plant the seeds for the future. The next treasury of secrets will be open soon.